Welcome, welcome, and we'll start right off with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I'm going to go into the share, and hopefully you're going to see it in a second or two. All right. So, of course, on Sundays we do Torah Temimah, and that's what we're going to look at today. And we are going very slowly. Actually, breakneck speed. We're actually on Genesis chapter 2, and we are actually looking at verse 14. So the second little comment that Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein has on this. Kidmat Ashur, so east of Assyria or Ashur. We won't even necessarily translate it as Assyria, east of Ashur. Okay. Tana, this is of course referring up to here. V'shem hanahar hashlishi Chidekel, right? The name of the third river is Chidekel, Tigris, hu haloch haholech kidmat Ashur. It journeys east of Ashur, v'hana'ar haravi'i Prat, and the fourth river is Prat. So we'll hopefully get to that in a moment. So here we are, Kidmat Ashur. Tana Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef taught, Ashur zu Selika. Ashur, this Ashur that they're talking about is Seleucia. And I think that's somewhere in the area of, maybe one of you know better than I do, but it's somewhere in the area of Syria and Turkey, I think, maybe on the border there. Remember the Seleucids, right? I assume came from there. Umi Havai us. But did it exist at that time? In other words, here they are talking about Ashur, and at this time of creation, right? We're talking about the creation of the world. Did it exist at the time? Ella, however, Shekatav Kra La'atid. What happened was Scripture, which was written after this period, it wrote this verse in referencing the future, right? It was going to reference the future time. So this is in Masechet Ketubot, the Talmud, the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, right? So here we go. Ritzono lomar. So what is this really trying to say, right? Shekra hakatuv shem davar. The scripture holds something, al pi Hashem shenitan lo to davar bisman haba. It referenced it by the name that was given to that very same thing at future time, at some future time. Uma shetzarich bazeh levaraita de Rav Yosef. But he still goes on. The Torah Temimah pushes it a little further, and he says, why do we need this baraita of Rav Yosef, Ashur Huslika? In other words, we're going to see, right? What is this baraita trying to say that Ashur is Seleucia, right? That we reference Ashur today, this Ashur by Seleucia. Because at least superficially, right, on the surface, hayal yachol likrot laakshot b'pshitut al shem Ashur. He could have just simply said, what is this Ashur doing here? Right? Did he have to say, well, Ashur is no longer called Ashur. This Ashur that's being mentioned, it's Seleucia. And then why did the Torah mention this and then saying, well, it was really referencing a future place? I mean, it could have just said, well, why does he call it Ashur? Ashur didn't exist at that time either, right? Mi havai babaraita. Let me make sure. Okay, mi havai bivriat olam. This is a vav here. He could have said, Ashur, was it around at the time of creation? Right? Could have used that question right there. Yesh lomar. So here is how this is his response. This is the Torah Temimah's response to this particular issue, right? This difficulty. Mishum de al shem Ashur levado, because had it simply said Ashur, right? Had the Torah simply mentioned Ashur, yesh lomar, one could say, kevan de afal pisha lo haita bevriat olam, that even though it wasn't around at the time of the creation of the world, al kol panim haita bimei Moshe, but at least you could say it did exist. Ashur did exist in the days of Moses, who wrote the Torah. ולכן כתב משה את השם שהיה בזמנו. And for that reason, Moses simply wrote Ashur because it existed in his time. That's why he wrote it. That would have been the answer. אבל מכיוון דאשור זו סליקה, but because this particular Ashur is Seleucia and not Assyria, ולא Ashur שבפסוק, right? And it's not this Ashur that is in the verse. In other words, even though the verse calls it Ashur, it's actually referencing Seleucia and not Assyria. And we already know that Seleucia, right, was later on, Achar Moshe, after Moses. It didn't exist in Moses' time. And nevertheless, here it is written in the Torah. For that reason, you are forced to the answer that the scripture was writing prophetically, right? And he says, and you can look, this guy has done so much work, and he studied so much, and his knowledge is so encyclopedic, right? And he says, check in the Tosafot. Tosafot, of course, Rashi's grandchildren, found on the pages of the Gemara. Maharsha, and the Maharsha, he's one of the boys in the back, as we mentioned. Shenitchaku b'zeh. They have this problem. They mention this very problem. Why mention Salika? Wouldn't it have been enough just to mention Assyria? They don't answer it. Ulefi ma shekatavnu ole hakol yafer. But based on what we have said, right, the explanation we just gave, there's no problem anymore. Vedok QED. Right. So, and of course, just standing back a moment, just to say, look at the intellectual curiosity and the sophistication of this particular, what we're doing here. Right. Okay. Hu Prat. Right. So remember we said, and the fourth river, Hu Prat. Vahanahar Haravi'i Hu Prat. And the fourth river is Prat. Now, we know that the definite article, the, always refers to something that is already in the context of what's going on. When we talk about the something, we're talking about something that's already been mentioned or that we're aware of in the context of what we're discussing, as opposed to which can introduce a whole new idea. That's sort of the force of this utility word, the or right? So, hu prat, it is prat. So there's an emphasis, right, on it is prat. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, said Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. Kol hanaharot lemata mishlosha naharot. All rivers derive from three rivers. Ushlosha naharot, and the three rivers lemata miprat. They derive from the Euphrates, from Prat. Okay, let's take a look at what he's saying here. He's got a little footnote there, so let's take a look at it. Brief footnote. Ritzono lomar, the point he's making is kol hanaharot nifradim mishlosha naharot, that all the rivers separate out from the three rivers. Chidekel, that is the three rivers, Chidekel, Pishon, V'Gihon, that is from, let's see, Chidekel, I think, is actually the Blue Nile. At least that's how we understand it. Pishon, I'm trying to think, possibly the Nile. Gihon, possibly the Tigris. But I think Chidekel, no, Chidekel is Tigris. So Gihon is the Blue Nile and Pishon is the Nile. Veshloshan naharot nifradim miprat, and the three rivers separate out from Euphrates. Now, if you have an elemental knowledge of geography, you know this is not talking about our geography. So I am forced to think that this is referencing something that we have to understand more on a spiritual level than anything else, and that we can't take this literally. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, maybe it's talking about an origin of rivers. I mean, the Torah isn't that kind of book. It's not talking about, paleontology and stuff like that. It's not, it's a book of literature. And it's saying something about the nature of rivers. We need to try to understand rivers more from a literary point of view and what rivers symbolize possibly. I'm not sure. I'll be honest with you, this is a relatively new comment for me, and I am trying to process it. But let's finish up what it's saying here. All right. Find it right here. Okay. So, v'hakativ v'hanahar haravi'i uprat. And he says, but just, it says the fourth river, right? We said three rivers. Why are we saying that it's that the other three rivers, that is the Nile, the Tigris, and the Blue Nile, derive from the Euphrates? Why do we say that? Why don't we just translate it as one of the four rivers? It's one four rivers. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, said Rab Nachman bar Yitzchak, hu prat me'ikara. It is, that is to say, the original river mentioned in Genesis chapter 2, verse 10 is Prat. That's what it's referring to. So if we look back there at Genesis 2:10, right? Because we're right now in Genesis 14, right? So let's look back at 10. Here we are. This is not too far back. It says, V'nahar yotzei me'eden. It says a river issues from Eden. It doesn't give a name. And it's saying that the Bible here is saying that this river that's mentioned, right, is actually Prat. That's what it means. That's why we say it says a Mishami parade, and from there it splits up Vahayala Arba'a, and then it becomes four rivers, so that you wind up with both the Euphrates and the other three rivers. So let's keep going. There's stuff to do here. Let's take a look here. Make sure I have the right place. And here we are. We're going to get there. Okay. Ritzono lomar, what he means to say. The halashon v'hanahar haravi'i. He says that the expression that we just referenced, right, in verse 10, where it talks about v'hanahar haravi'i and the fourth river, right? I'm sorry. Forgive me. We're talking about it here. Here it says, and the fourth river. So remember the word the, right? More sheprat hi chashuva. It's to tell you that Prat, that the Euphrates, chashuva ka'achat mikol hana'arot, right? And that Prat is counted amongst as one of all the rivers. Ve'at amarta mina ka'atu. And you are saying, I think that's what it's meaning, that that the other rivers came from it. Remember, we said that when that one river became four rivers, we're talking about the one river, and it still continued as the Euphrates. Umashni, right? And what it's trying to teach us is the kavanat halashon hu prat, and that the purpose, the intent of this expression hu prat, that is prat, right? Ritzono lomar, what it's trying to say is hu prat haniskar lamala. It's referring to, that is the prat that is referenced above, and here's that verse 10, the Nahar Yotzei, where it talks about a river issues. And the other three are separated from it. Okay, so he's explained a little bit of the language involved here, but he's got more to say here. Veda, and no, The ita b'mishnah brachot, that in the Mishnah of Tractate Brachot, Nun Aleph Aleph, right? So I believe this is it's a tractate in the Babylonian Talmud, page 55a, the A side of the page. Here it goes. The Al Hanaharot Omer Baruch Oseh Maaseh Breshit. That when you come to a river, right? It says there that if you come to a river, presumably, I imagine it's not necessarily the first time in your life, but let's say the first time in a significant period of time, maybe a month, whatever, you are supposed to make a bracha. The bracha is, blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, sovereign of the universe, who performs works of creation, Maaseh Breshit, right? The Katvu HaTosafot, and the Tosafot wrote, we've mentioned that before, right? The love davka al kol hanarot mevarech, that when it says he blesses rivers, right, it doesn't mean every single river, right? Ela rak al otan haktuvim beparsha b'maaseh Reshit, but only on one of those four rivers mentioned in creation. Yes, David.
So, aren't these actually tributaries? That's where I got confused because there are three flowing out of one, right? So, aren't
Right.
they typically? So, yeah. Anyway, so
they themselves aren't. A tributary is a river that flows into another river.
right. So, aren't these the three came out of the original?
Correct. So actually, Euphrates would be a tributary to the other three rivers
Okay.
because they come out, they flow from the
From
Euphrates.
okay. Yeah, it's just we're calling them four rivers. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. Again, we want to be careful about being hung up in geography here, okay? I'm not saying you are, I'm just saying in general, but we're saying that those other three rivers, that when it mentioned about that original river, which was unnamed, and in that is the Euphrates, that's the meaning of the language that's being used here in the verse, right? And now we're discussing, he's introducing and discussing a point of halacha. The halacha is that when you see, the way it's stated in the brachot, it's when you see a river, you're supposed to make a bracha, right? And Tosafot is saying, wait a second, they're looking at the bracha, which is, blessed are you, etc., who performs works of creation, that it refers only to the four rivers that are mentioned in creation. In other words, it's only when you come onto the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Blue Nile, that's where you make the bracha. You don't make the bracha over any single river. Okay, that's what Tosafot is saying. Okay, v'chein piresh b'orech Chaim, and he says that's how it's explained in the Orech Chaim. What's the Orech Chaim? It's one of the four volumes, major volumes of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is it's sometimes interpreted as the code of Jewish law, but it is in many ways a summation of Jewish law that was in practice as it developed through the Talmud and through the subsequent commentators, etc. It is an amazing work, okay? And that's what he's referring to, is this first of these four volumes, the way Jewish law is organized in the Shulchan Aruch. Siman Reish Kavchet, that would be chapter 228, Seif Bet, paragraph 2. So again, it's very well referenced so that it's easy to look up the references, okay? V'hamagain Avraham, and the Magain Avraham is one of the major commentators on the Shulchan Aruch. You have to understand that we are talking about well-plowed fields here from a research standpoint. And so the Shulchan Aruch itself, of course, is this incredible work on halacha, right, on Jewish law, and then it comes along with a number of important commentaries. It's always written pretty much with these other commentaries, and the Magen Avraham is one of the important commentators on the Shulchan Aruch. Very often, because Jewish law isn't sort of, how can I put it, a monolithic every single place. Remember that very important principle of circumstances alter cases. So people like the Magen Avraham is someone who will discuss the laws mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch as they might apply in a particular area. Okay. Now the Shulchan Aruch is, even though it was compiled initially by a Sephardic Jew, it nevertheless is considered to be the repository of Orthodox Jewish law. It is not the last word, okay, but it is a major foundation of Orthodoxy. So he says the Magen Avraham hiksha, he raises an objection. Lama lo yivrechu al sha'ar naharot gedolot. Why shouldn't one, in fact, right? The Tosafot and the let's see, who did we say? The Tosafots questioned that. They said, no, it's, that when the Talmud says over rivers, it just means the 4 original rivers. And the Magen Avraham is saying, why so? Why not just over any of the remaining large rivers? You go to the Amazon, hey, say a bracha, right? And other major rivers. You see the Mississippi, the Missouri, say a bracha. Shenivra'u, okay, misheshet yemei bereshit, right? Sha'ar, in other words, other great rivers that were created from the 6 days of creation. Remember, we did say that all subsequent rivers derive from these particular rivers, right? So that in some senses, in other words, the whole, maybe, as I'm meditating on this, the whole concept of rivers and the degree to which they bring water and consequently the ability to exist is something that we're talking about here, and why we'd make a bracha. The Katav, right? Be'emet, and the Magen Avraham going on to say, and he wrote that in fact, Tzarich levarech al kol naharot gedolot, that the actual halacha is that you are supposed to make a bracha, right? Oseh maaseh bereshit, every time you see, or should I say that when you significantly come to a very large river, a major river. Ye'uyan Sham, he says, check the Magen Avraham, and you'll see that he says this. V'chol zeh garam lo, and the reason he says this, the reason that the Magen Avraham raises that objection, mipnei shehu savar, and that is because he is of the opinion, he reasoned, that tam habracha al arba naharot, that the reason for the brecha, for the blessing, the benediction over the 4 rivers, hu mipnei shehem mishunot, is simply because they are distinguished, let's say, right? As is implied from his own words, from the Magen Abraham's own words. Aval be'emet, but actually, okay, so maybe when it says, let's see, no, okay, they just happen to be singled out. Aval be'emet al pi hadrasha shelefanenu, but in fact, based on this interpretation that we have just read, right? Mitba'er, it appears, right? It becomes clarified. The tam habracha, that the reason for this bracha, for this benediction, hu mipnei she'ele ha'arba naharot, because these particular 4 rivers, hem yesodi umekori, because they are the foundation, right, and the essence, the source, kol hanaharot shebalam, of all the other rivers that are in the world. V'af ki prat lemala gam ala shlosha, that, and despite the fact that the Euphrates is above the other 3, right? They all derive from the Euphrates. Aval gam heim mekorim heim, but they themselves, it says, they themselves are the sources of the other rivers. Ve'im kain, and if this is the case, ein kol shayachut bracha zo l'chol hanorot, then there is no reason to make a bracha on every single river. There's a reason why these particular rivers are picked out, Zulat Arba Elu, with the exception of these four. These are the only ones on which we make a bracha. The Necha Psak HaShulchan Aruch, and the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch that it's only over these four rivers is in fact appropriate. The Dok, and he says again, QED. And we'll have to leave it here, I'm afraid, until next time. So, okay, let's see here. So I'm going to move this up here. And God willing, we will do this the next time. I'm going to stop the share. All right, this is your moment if you want to comment, etc., for the record. Otherwise, I am going to stop the recording. So I have a feeling that's what's going to happen.